Hello, welcome to the final of the Volca SonicLAB reviews. Today we're looking at the Volca Keys, and I know a lot of you have been basically gagging for this one. For some reason it's taken your imagination, and that's not surprising really, because what we have here is essentially a 3-voice analog poly. Although you can play in unison in other modes, it does have a 3 oscillator mode. First of all, we'll talk a little bit about construction quality, because I know a lot of you have been asking specifically about that. They do feature the same Monotron style knobs, and they are wobbly, but they're definitely better mounted than the Monotrons. I'd say this whole case feels a lot more sturdy than these surface mount connectors here feel like they're okay. You know, I mean, really, for 120 quid, I'm not expecting something to be built to military specs, but you know, it seems to me quite adequate. One thing that is quite interesting is this Volca Keys seems to be a bit noisier than the other ones. If I switch the channel on and maybe crank that up, you can hear that there's a bit of noise there. I mean, that is very loud, but noticeably more so than the drums and the bass. Anyway, let's take a listen to the waveform. It's a sawtooth. So that's the only available waveform, although you can kind of get some other flavors with the voice modes, but more on that later. Let's go and take a look at the connectors in depth. As with the other Volcas, we've got a power switch, 9-volt DC center positive power input. Doesn't come with the unit. You get 6 AA batteries that are included. Then we've got a MIDI input, which I plugged in here, a sync in and out like on the other Volca, so you can hook them all up together and create a kind of a bit of sync fun, or perhaps hook them up to modules in your modular kit or other clock syncable devices. Same front panel layout, except of course on this one we've also got the addition of an analog delay. One last thing you should look at, there is actually, as with all the other Volcas, a little tiny kind of headphone style speaker at the bottom, so you can use it you know, if you don't want to plug headphones in or without any amplification. So filter is definitely the next port of call on these units, so let's take a listen to that. But if I bring the resonance up, there's a little bit of stepping. I don't know what the filter is, it doesn't mention the specific type, but it doesn't sound quite the same as the 700S type in the bass. We've got a fully featured attack, decay, sustain, release envelope, so we can just add sustain portion, or turn the sustain down and just have a kind of little blip. The cutoff envelope is also modulatable. Whoops, that's here. So you can get that. And also you've got pitch modulation too. So if you want to do synth-toms, then you can do it fine. There's also an LFO on the unit. If I go here, so I can modulate the pitch, cutoff amount, reasonably slow, right up into the audio spectrum. We can change the waveform of the LFO by hitting, we've got saw, tri and square. So if we go into sawtooth, it's quite nice when you combine it with a bit of delay for a little extra space. So looking at the delay now, we've got 2 buttons here, feedback and time. So if I just introduced a bit of time, it's quite noisy and crusty, probably 0.7 of a second, 3/4 of a second maybe. A welcome addition, certainly adds quite a lot of flavour to a lot of sounds, but definitely a bit sort of noisy and crusty, you know, that's just the way it goes. I quite like it. Another thing to mention is the opportunity to detune the voices. We've got portamento as well. But the main thing is there are these 6 voice modes. We're listening to poly. If I now plug the MIDI in, because that makes it a bit easier to play, which is the same deal. So I've got it hooked up to my Axiom Air here. And we'll listen to the different voice modes. We're in poly mode here. If I go into unison, that brings all of the voices into unison mode, and then we've got a detune, which we can take to quite a dissonant level, although we can't tune it over things like semitones, and you can't get that sort of stuff. But next one is octaves, which sets them all to 3 octave modes. Again, we can detune those for extra thickness. Then we've got a 5th mode. Detune again applies. Unison ring mod. Which gives us a kind of square wave type sound. And then finally, we've got poly ring, which is quite interesting. So start with a single note. Another note will add the ring mod frequency up to 3, and we can create some really kind of dissonant tones with that as well. One thing that I did notice, and this is something you notice on the poly mode, if I bring this up and I play, it's velocity sensitive, so I'll start with maybe a quiet note, and then add a second quiet, and then add another high note, and then take it away. It increases the velocity of the first note. So they obviously share a single VCA, or perhaps it's doing something clever, you know, where mapping velocity to the overall volume of the unit. That might be something that it's doing as well. While we're on the subject of MIDI, we've got quite extensive mapping capabilities here. This is the MIDI sheet that you can download from Korg and print out. Portamento, expression, which is essentially volume, voice, mode, octave, detune, all the usual sounds, but also cutoff frequency here, which might explain why it's a little bit steppy, because it's snapping to 128 values. VCF, blah, 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 LFO, cutoff, internet, decay, release, envelopes, delay, time and feedback. That's actually quite an interesting one, because obviously if you modulate the delay time, you can get some interesting kind of chorus type effects. I've got it set up here. And I've got it mapped to a controller on this Axiom Air, so I can get this kind of chorusy thing, which actually brings me to an interesting point. If somebody made a software update which allowed you to have an internal LFO or 2 on a MIDI controller, so you can modulate controller amounts, controller values by specific amounts, you would kind of be able to do all sorts of interesting additional synthesizer functions on a standard MIDI controller. So if somebody wants to do that, I'll be all ears. So obviously there's a sequencer on the Volca Keys, which is ostensibly the same as the others, as in the 16-step, but it's got a lot of other neat features as well. So if I now plug my sync cable in from the Volca bass, got a little sequencer just to sort of guide me, press record, now play a little line. You can hear it's quantizing to the steps of the sequencer, as you'd expect. I now just clear that, and now I'm going to go to flux mode, which is this one here, switch that on, and what I'm essentially getting is a quantized free recording. So I can now do the same thing. So it records what I play. And that's really cool, because it means I can, you know, do a bit more freeform. But there's more to it than that. If I now clear that sequence again and come into another function, I've got tempo, and I'm in 1-to-1 tempo. I can go 1-to-2, 1-to-4. So effectively I do that, I get 4 bars of playback to 1 bar from my external sync. So now if I'm in record, I can get really busy. Got a full 4-bar pattern there that's just running X quantize. And now the other thing that's very cool is now I can introduce the thought of motion sequence. So what I can do here is record any of these front panel I can pretty much record all of those parameters, apart from the two knobs here, into the sequencer in terms of motion. So I get lots and lots. So I could have a 4-bar pattern, unquantized, with all kinds of motion stuff going on. And that is another interesting factor, which is that you can actually record motion without recording notes. So therefore, for instance, I could record some rhythmic parts into the sequencer. I clear this, go into one-to-one mode. And again, press my sequencer, and what that allows me to do, if I go into record, I can record filter movements in time and then just play along with them. So it could be any parameter, but that means I could actually have tempo synced parameter changes, but real-time playing through the unit. So it kind of live, you could see how that might start to do some interesting things with the polysynth. So a couple of other features in the sequencer. As with all the other ones, we've got active steps, so we can switch on and off various parts, or just create perhaps a 12-beat or a 6-beat length pattern. That's kind of useful. We've also got the ability to add a metronome, which means I can play along a lot easier. I only just spotted that, actually. It's quite handy. We've also got things like the ability to sync the tempo to the delay, or sync the delay to the tempo. We've got the opportunity to change step trigger, which what that does is trigger the envelope on each step, all sorts of other things. So really the sequencer is much more fully featured on the Volca Keys than perhaps on any of the other ones. So once again, you know, you get a lot of features for the money. £120, €139, $149 is the price you're going to pay on the streets. I mean, as they become more and more available, I think we're going to see them everywhere. The fact that we've got MIDI and the fact that we've got all these other features, the sequencer on the Volca Keys is actually very interesting, certainly for modulation and movement. I just really like it. The only weak link I think perhaps about the Volca Keys is the filter. It doesn't feel all that musical to me. It just doesn't have the same sort of vibe, say, as the Volca bass. And certainly for polyphonic sounds, it's not quite as strong. But 3-voice poly, fully featured sequencer, or at least what one can expect in a small unit like this, it's hard to see why you wouldn't want to own one. Personally, I'd have one of these and a Volca bass, or possibly 2 of these and 2 Volca basses. It's very tempting, and at this price, it's a very easy decision to make.